Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Taiwan Studies Program event with the book talk with Dr. Dafydd on Taiwan's Green Parties. My name is James Lin. I'm an assistant professor of Taiwan Studies here at the University of Washington. I'd like to go ahead and jump in right away to introduce Dr. Fell. Dafydd J. Fell is the reader in comparative politics with special reference to Taiwan at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, better known as SOAS, at the University of London. He's the director of the SOAS Center of Taiwan Studies. In 2004, he was a part of establishing the European Association of Taiwan Studies. He's published several books, including Party Politics in Taiwan, published by Routledge in 2005, which analyzed party change in the first 15 years of multi-party competition in Taiwan, as well as Government and Politics in Taiwan, published by Routledge first in 2011 and then the second edition in 2018. Today, we're very lucky to have Dr. Fell for his newest book, Taiwan's Green Parties, Alternative Politics in Taiwan, published by Routledge in 2021. So without further ado, I would like to bring on Dr. Fell to go ahead and start with his talk.
Fantastic. Thanks, James, for that kind introduction. So let me just share the screen here. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so it's wonderful to be here in Washington. It's my first Washington Taiwan Studies lecture. And for me, as someone who's been trying to promote international Taiwan studies over the last couple of decades, it's always really exciting to see new Taiwan studies programs emerging in such a vibrant way. And the other thing I should say is there's a number of links between both this book, but also my academic career and some of the figures in Taiwan studies here at Washington. For example, Jeff Ho, who's in your landscape architecture department, is someone who he was probably one of the first people to inspire me to get into doctoral studies on Taiwan, along with a number of other academics. When I first started joining academic Taiwan studies conferences in the US back in the late 1990s. Another kind of link between my work and University of Washington is your new sociologist, Xiao Yuan, who appears in the chapter on 2012. So let me kind of get into this book talk. So today I'm going to talk about my new book that just came out in March 2021, Taiwan's Green Parties, Alternative Politics in Taiwan. So this is my third book, but it's essentially my second PhD style book. And for many of us academics, the second research monograph is one of the most challenging elements of an academic career. Once we kind of get heavily involved in teaching and administration, and just now I was talking to James about examination marking, it can be very difficult to have that same kind of focus that we had for our PhDs. And in fact, not long after I finished my PhD, I did start a second research monograph project, and after 5 years, I ended up dropping that and doing something much broader for my second book. So this is essentially my second PhD style book, and it took me something like 8 years to actually produce. And one of the things I will do a little bit in today's talk is touch upon some of the differences between that PhD themed book and this post-PhD research monograph. So what I'm going to try and do in today's talk is talk a little bit about how I actually got started in this project. As with a lot of academic projects, there wasn't a master plan. a lot of it was down to chance. I'll talk about some of the research questions that drive the project, and how I link these to big political science debates. I'll talk about the fieldwork and research material that I used to put this book together and made this project so enjoyable, but also quite different from the methods that I used for my early research. Then what I'll do is talk through briefly what I cover in each chapter. Usually with these kind of book talks, we don't go into a huge amount of detail, but I'll give you a sense of the kind of the themes of each chapter and some of the puzzles that I try to address. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing now, how I'm kind of moving on, but actually trying to build on this book. So I first became interested in party politics in Taiwan as an undergraduate when I was doing my language training year in National Zhengzhi University in Taipei. And that happened to coincide with the first semi-democratic election in Taiwan. In other words, the first election where we had legal opposition parties. And this picture here on the left comes from that initial visit to Taiwan in 1989 into 1990. And of course, a feature of that election was getting to know these mainstream political parties, the DPP and the KMT. But what also made that election interesting was that a lot of new parties were established, including small and leftist parties. And that kind of sparked my interest in Taiwan's small parties, particularly because in some of my early years living in Taiwan in the 1990s, particularly in the early 1990s, the Labour Party's base was mainly in southern Taiwan. After living in Taiwan for, 8 years, I came back to the UK to start my PhD. And as James mentioned, my PhD, which became my the basis of my first book, looked at party change in that first decade and a little bit more of multi-party politics. Much of the focus of that book was on the two mainstream parties, the DPP and the KMT. But my third party case was the New Party, which was quite a significant party in the mid to late 1990s. And what I found really interesting about this smaller party was that often the frameworks to explain party behavior that worked for the mainstream parties didn't work so well for the smaller and more ideological New Party. So I was kind of puzzled about why would a political party do things that just seemed like electoral suicide, that just didn't seem rational. And not long after I finished this book, I tried to look at the overall development of Taiwanese small parties or new parties in a publication for China and International Journal. Now, most of that focus was on the splinter parties that split away from the two mainstream parties, such as the New Party or the People's First Party. And when I went back to check that article, I discovered I did have a couple of very short paragraphs on the Taiwan Green Party. But clearly this was more like a footnote. And I think at that point in time, it would have seemed unimaginable to devote 8 years of research on something so seemingly marginal to Taiwan's party politics. So what really kind of got me into this project was almost a random email from one of my former students, Yuan Ru, who had been studying anthropology at my food anthropology at my university, and not long after she submitted her dissertation, she went on to stand for election for Taiwan's parliament for the Green Party. And as someone who'd studied mainstream party politics, it seemed unimaginable that someone could go to an election with such short preparation, just a matter of a few months. So that kind of also caught my attention. And then in the autumn of 2012, Yuanru wrote to me to ask if I'd be interested in doing some research on Taiwan's Green Party, that there was some funding available from the Australian Greens. So I decided to put together a research project together with a Taiwanese academic who I believe has also spent some time at the University of Washington as a visiting scholar, Peng Yanwen. And what we did was to set up a couple of focus groups to look at the Green Party's overall development since its formation through to the most recent election at that point in 2012. So I think it was the experience of running these two focus groups that really hooked me onto this this topic. Because one of the things that I discovered from these focus groups was how different these activists and party leaders were compared to the mainstream party politicians that I'd spent the earlier part of my career looking at. They were so idealistic, so passionate, and so angry. And for me, that was really kind of something that really caught my attention. And here you can see your University of Washington sociologist Xiao Yuan here in the middle. At this point in time, I think he was probably maybe he just graduated from his master program. And even though it looks like a quite cheerful occasion, actually, this focus group was particularly, there was a lot of anger, even though the most recent election was 11 months ago. So I've talked about some of the kind of the personal reasons that brought me into this topic, but what about the academic reasons for looking at Taiwan's Green parties? Well, I think one of the big challenges that we have when we study Taiwan is how do we engage with readerships or audiences beyond the main Taiwan studies field. And the key way that we do this, or I try to do this, is to link Taiwan to political science theories and frameworks. And that allows us to speak to wider audiences with that kind of language. So in this book, what I try to do is to engage with party politics literatures on small and movement parties. To what extent do those kind of theories and frameworks work in the Taiwan case? To what extent do we need to adjust those frameworks? Looking at Green parties also allows us to engage with the pretty significant literature on global green political parties. And a further way that I try to justify this project is that it offers us a way to think about Taiwan's civil society and party system, but from quite a different angle. In other words, I think readers of this book will that know Taiwan's civil society or party system will feel a lot of these elections and movement case studies look quite familiar, but the angle I'm taking is quite different. So, for example, we can see the role that the Taiwan Green Party plays in the evolution of Taiwan's LGBT rights movement. For example, that it's the first party to openly advocate same-sex marriage. It's the first party to nominate openly gay candidates. But we can also get a sense of the evolution of the environmental movement, particularly the anti-nuclear movement, which is so central to the Taiwan Green Party, particularly in its early years. And it also allows us to think about Taiwan's party system that has been so dominated by the two mainstream national identity oriented parties. And we can look at the space that the party system offers for alternative and political parties, such as the Taiwan Green Party. Now, unlike my first book, Party Politics in Taiwan, where I just focused on 3 core questions, this book is a little bit more ambitious with more research questions. But I divide them into how, who, so what, and why questions. For example, I look at the way that the party has evolved. For example, the way it's changed its policy priority over time and policy positions, and the way that it's changed organizationally. The who question looks at what kind of people have led and represented the party, and what kind of people have supported the party. The so what question looks at election results and how these fluctuate over time. But it also looks at the way that the party has tried to engage internationally with other Green parties and the global Greens networks. And finally, the issue that I probably devote the most time is to the why questions. I look at how we explain the formation of the Green parties, how we explain why the party changes, and most significantly of all, I look at how we best explain electoral performance. And when we think about the comparative studies on small parties, that's the question that gets the most attention. Now, one of the things that I try to argue in this book is, although the party is not especially successful electorally, what I try to show is that failure was never inevitable. And in my framework for explaining the Green Party's performance focuses on 2 major dimensions: party system factors. In other words, I'm looking at the strategies of mainstream parties, particularly the DPP, but I also look at the impact of competing parties, both splinter and other movement parties, on the party's performance. But what I try to argue, though, is that the most important factors explaining the party's success or failure is factors that are internal to the party. In other words, looking at the way that the party gets a balance between its party ideals and vote maximizing. And the picture that I've used here gives us a sense of this kind of framework. This picture here is a campaign endorsement ad from 2014. And we can see the kind of people who are endorsing the political party in late 2014. However, what we can see later on is how many of these endorsers don't end up endorsing the Green Party in the next round of national elections. Some of them choose to affiliate with the DPP, while others go to the SDP or the New Power Party. And I think this gives us a sense of the potential, but also some of the weaknesses. And I'll talk about these as I go through the chapter structure. So what I'm going to do next then is just to talk you through some of the methods that I used for answering these kind of big questions. Some of the now the first thing that I started off with focus groups, and here we can see both the party leader and activist focus group. This was the one featuring long-term figures from the party's history. But I also did focus groups with party members. Many of these members would also later go on to be campaigners and then candidates. A further method that I used that overlapped with my first book was interviews. But here the difference was that I was doing interviews over a 7-year period, and often interviewing the same people multiple times. So I interviewed about 50 Green Party figures for this project, but I was interviewing them over sometimes 3 or even 4 times. I didn't do many. Most of the interviews were face-to-face, and it was only in the final stage that I did some online interviews. Another method that that we used was interviewing supporters, and again, that's something that I hadn't done in the past. I should also note that I'm sometimes using the we, because in the early stage of this project, I was working together with a Taiwanese scholar, Peng Yen, and together we published a couple of articles, and she's also working with me on the Chinese version. Online resources were also very useful for this project, much more so than in for the first book. So for example, election gazettes, and here I've got an election gazette listing for the new for the Green Party Taiwan for the 2020 election. And this allows us to do time series analysis to look at different years' election gazettes. Here we have the policy proposals, we have the candidates' names, we have the ages, gender, date, birthplace, education, and experience. And these are all really useful, both for what is the party, but also who is the Green Party. Other really useful sources were party websites, party and candidate social media, candidate blogs, such as here we have a piece that was coming out of one of the star candidate Pan Hansen's blog. But also audiovisual material was also much more useful. While for my first book, what I had to do was to collect video cassettes of election ads. For this project, it was sources such as YouTube, which is again extremely valuable. So overall, the kind of sources that I was using was much more diverse than for my first book. Now, one of the reasons for this was that while in my first book, I relied very heavily on political advertising, newspaper and TV ads. With a couple of exceptions, the Green Party never buys TV ads, except for it maybe in 2020. So this meant looking at posters and also ads that the party put on, or videos that the party put on YouTube or on social media. For example, on the right, we have a clip from the Green Party's 2016 election video. So again, this brought really useful qualitative data to give us a sense of how the party's campaign appeals change over time. The writing process again was very different from the first book. With the PhD, the writing tends to be very concentrated, at least in the UK, over the last 2 years of the PhD. In this case, it took me a long time to actually start writing the book. So I started the research project in December of 2012. And although I published a couple of short pieces with Peng Yen, the writing only started in roughly the middle of November 2019. And most of the writing was done in approximately 3 months in late 2019 and early 2020, with the final chapters written post-review in the summer of 2020. So again, I was very fortunate that I had a sabbatical of just 1 term, but that gave me a little bit of space to finally get the writing done. I'd originally planned to write the book in 2016, but I kept getting distracted by other things. So what I'm going to do next then is just talk through briefly what I try to cover in the main chapters. I'm not going to talk about the theoretical and literature review, chapter 2, and jump straight into chapter 3, which sometimes I feel this is my favorite chapter, which looks at party formation. And here I should note the fact that the book is called Taiwan's Green Parties. So it's plural. And in this chapter, I look at the establishment of 3 political parties. A first failed attempt to create a Green Party, where we do actually see a party inaugural launch with much media attention in 1995, but it's an aborted party that never gets registered with Taiwan's Ministry of Interior. I look at the factors that lead to the establishment of the Green Party Taiwan that we know today, and to what extent they fit in with what the movement party literature suggests we would expect. And here we can see that the movement party's literature often puts stress on the emergence of new issues in the establishment of new parties. But in this case, what we have is a mainstream party, the DPP, that had already owned the environmental issues since its formation. But we see by the mid-1990s that the civil society, sectors of civil society are losing trust in the DPP, and this partly explains the establishment of this new party. But I also devote some attention to the establishment of the Trees Party that splits away from the Green Party in 2014. So if you think back to the focus group picture where we saw Pan Hansen taking part in late 2012, he's the one that goes on to establish, together with a couple of other Green Party defectors, this new party, the Trees Party. So while the 1996 Green Party formation focuses on theories of party formation, the 2014 Trees Party establishment is more engaged with theories of party switching. The next chapter looks at the impact of the Green parties. And here the focus is mainly on elections. And I look at the party's overall electoral trajectory. But I also look at this through the lens of individual districts, particularly focusing on the stronger campaigns, such as the first successful elected Green Party politician, Go Meng-ding, who's elected in 1996, when the party is less than 2 months old. But I look at a range of these, and this gives us a sense of the way that Taiwan's electoral system works, both at the local and the national level. But the other major dimension that I focus on in terms of impact is the party's impact internationally. So here I look at the way that the party engages with the Global Greens network, the way that it helps to create the Asia Pacific Greens network, and is a founding member of Global Greens. And one of the things that comes through in a lot of my field work was how meaningful many Green activists find this international engagement. And here we have one example of this, where the Taiwan Green Party visits the UK in 2017 to take part in the Global Greens Congress, which was held in Liverpool. And then following that participation, they, and together also the Trees Party, came to my university to speak about their issues and party development. The next chapter, chapter 5, looks at the who question. And here I look at the kind of people that have led and represented the party. But also I look at the kind of people that have supported the party. Now, this picture from a press conference in 1998 gives us a bit of a sense of the human face of the party. For example, we see the party founder, Gao Chengyan, who's an anti-nuclear environmentalist and professor, but he's also someone who was in the pro-independence movement in the US. So he was someone that was blacklisted when he was living in the US in the 70s and 80s because of his political activism. But he's also someone who's never joined the DUP. We also see a female party leader here, who will go on to be the first female party leader of the Green Party. We see a Austrian Green figure, Franz Floss, which I think reflects the international side of the party. But we also have Linda Arrigo, who is an important scholar and dissident, but she was also the international officer of the party and was critical in the party's international links in its first 5 to 6 years. Well, one of the other things I was quite interested to look at was to what extent do the background of Green Party supporters correspond with those that we see in European Green Party supporters. And to a large extent, we do see overlap. In other words, supporters tend to be younger, better educated, more liberal on issues such as gender rights. They tend to have more experience of political protest or involvement with social movements, and are much more likely to be based in urban areas compared to rural areas. So in this chapter, I also give some of the life stories of the key figures that are going to feature in the subsequent chapters. I think I choose something like 13 or 14 biographical stories to tell. What I do then next is to go through the party's history chronologically, starting with the first election in 1996, just a few, something like 6 weeks after the party's formation. And 1996 is a critical year because it's the first year Taiwan has its first direct presidential election, but it's also corresponding with the 1996 and 1995-1996 cross-strait missile crisis. And here we can see then how the party tries to get that critical media attention. And the way that the party did, one of the ways that the party did this was that the party leader went out into the Chinese missile test zone, just to show how strong the party was against the Chinese threat. So here we can see how the party is trying to engage with that key salient national identity China issue. And I set a precedent here in this chapter by looking at how the party campaigns, and also how we explain variation. In other words, some of the candidates were much more successful at gaining support. And again, I look at the balance between the candidates' appeals, but also I touch upon some of the mainstream party factors as well. The next chapter moves on to the local elections of 1998. And what we see here is that the party overall performs more poorly in this election compared to 1996. It's very concentrated on Taipei City. And even within Taipei City, one of its candidates, Peng Yan-wen, is by far the best candidate and the closest to winning the election. So much of this chapter looks at why was her campaign different? How was she able to get that critical media attention that was required to break through the bottleneck? The next chapter looks at what I call the Green Party's quiet period. And this chapter is a little bit different from the other chapters because it's not focused so much on elections, because the party almost stops joining elections. Its candidates are almost token candidates who are really on the margins of the election. So they're no longer competitive. Instead, I mainly focused on two questions. One, how to explain the collapse of the party after 1998? And then how does the party rebuild? And again, your visiting scholar Peng Yan-wen would play a key role in rebuilding the party after she returned, after her PhD. So after almost stopping joining elections for the previous 6 years, the party returns to taking part in elections in 2006. And in this chapter, I look at 3 campaigns: local elections in 2006, national elections in 2008, and a by-election in 2009. And here we have a number of puzzles that I try to address. For example, in 2006, the party has a number of very experienced environmental figures and gets very strong support from the blogger community. However, in these 3 elections, the party's results fall short of the results it was getting in the 1990s. We also see the picture on the right is from a treetop protest in which the Green Party's by-election candidate, Calvin Wen, joins a protest against the chopping down of trees in Taipei City. And this again gets very significant media attention. However, his performance in the campaign was quite disappointing. So in that part of the chapter, I look at what did the party do wrong? For example, how did it its relationship with the DP go wrong? What were the problems with its campaign? And we start to see a feature in 2009 that will become more and more present in some of the subsequent chapters of party divisions and party infighting that will often be quite an important factor in the limited progress the party makes. Then I come to the chapters that looks at 2010 local elections and 2012 national elections. And here we see the party trying to make a transition from being one that just joins elections to one that can be competitive. So the party tries to reorganize, and we do see improved performances. So it is getting back to the level that it saw in the late and mid 1990s. And we also see a change approach. In other words, we see much more focus on gender issues and youth-related issues. So, for example, in this leaflet, in addition to Pan Han-sheng, who we've mentioned a number of times, we see my former student, Yuan Ru, but we also see the one of the party's first openly gay candidates, Wang Zhongming, who runs a number of very strong campaigns in Danshui. However, we also see some of the weaknesses of this campaign. For example, I particularly focus on the campaign of Pan Han-sheng in Taipei City, where he works in a informal alliance with the DPP. And this was the campaign where the University of Washington sociologist Xiaoyan was part of that campaign team, was so useful for the research on 2012. Then I move on to another round of party reorganization for the 2014 campaign. This chapter is also a little bit different, as in this chapter, I look at two party cases, both the Green Party Taiwan, but also the Trees Party that's defected away from the party. And here again, we see a new organizational model led by the environmentalist Li Genzhen. And what we see here is a much better funded party. It's moving to a much more professional setup. But it also has weaknesses. For example, the party split that I talk about in chapter 3. And when the results were announced in November of 2014, there was both celebrations, but also a degree of disappointment that even though the party does win 2 seats, it didn't win as many as it was expecting, because it did have some very strong candidates. For example, Wang Zhongming, who had run such a strong campaign in the previous round of local elections, or Fu Jingfan in Penghu, who had looked like he had a very good chance of winning. So I call this chapter Unfinished Progress, which suggests that the party has made progress, but it's still not ready to break through. At this point in time, the Green Party is the largest alternative party. In the aftermath of the Sunflower Movement, the other alternatives have not yet formally established, but they're getting ready. And we see this in the next chapter, the 2016 chapter that looks at the Green Party Social Democratic Party alliance, which I call the lunchbox and teenage idol election. And here I first look at the factors that led to the creation of the Green Party Social Democratic Alliance, but also why the party only manages to get 2.5% of the national vote compared to 1.7% in 2012, despite being much better funded, having a much longer history, having stronger candidates. But it's the brand new power party that emerges out of the Sunflower Movement that actually makes the critical breakthrough and enters parliament, despite being less than a year old compared to the 10-year-old Green Party. And here I look both at party system factors, such as strategies of the DBP, for example, co-opting the same-sex marriage issue, but also the competition of the New Power Party and the way that this takes away potential supporters. But again, most of the analysis looks at the failures within the Green Party's own campaign. For example, the way that it mishandles its relationship with the Social Democratic Party, but also the way that the party mishandles its potential relationship with the DBP. So it does have the potential for working together with the DBP on a similar model to the New Power Party, but it loses that opportunity. Next, I look at 2018. Here we're back to local elections, and we have the next round of party reorganization with a new set of a much younger leadership that's closely tied to the controversial local Taoyuan councillor, Wang Haoyu. And I call this chapter, the subtitle of this chapter is Winning or Selling Its Soul. And I look at the way that the party seems to be shifting its priorities. Wang Haoyu makes the statement that this time we're not just campaigning on ideals, we are campaigning to get elected. And we see this focus on getting elected, even if it means working together with politicians that don't match the Green Party ideologically. For example, working together with politicians who are not supportive of same-sex marriage. And this leads to a lot of disappointment from traditional supporters. For example, Peng Yanwen argues that the people who are left don't really understand the GPT's values. They don't stress these values. They don't stress these values. They care more about political calculations, and that can damage our reputation. So one of the things that was clear here was that some former supporters were no longer comfortable supporting the Green Party and began to shift their support to the stronger movement party, the New Power Party. And then I come to the final chapter that I look at in terms of elections, and that's the most recent national elections in 2020. I call this chapter the Deng Hui-wen or Wang Haoyu Green Party campaigns. There is a link to the party's formation in that Gao Chengyan, the party founder, the one that went out to catch missiles in 1996, stands for election again, I think for the fourth time. And I was very excited about this returning to the past. But the focus of the campaign was not on Gao. It was on Wang Haoyu and Deng Hui-wen, and their very contrasting campaign styles. And in this chapter, one of the big puzzles is, why does the party do almost exactly the same as 2016? In other words, it gets a higher number of votes, but almost exactly the same vote share of 2.4%, despite the fact that so many of its former supporters defect away from the party to support either DPP, State Building Party, or the New Power Party. But it's able to win enough new supporters, particularly using the appeal of the well-known psychiatrist Deng Hui-wen. But the party's approach alienates so many traditional supporters. So some openly call on voters not to vote for the Green Party anymore. And then the final chapter in the book looks at the aftermath of the 2020 campaign and the way that the party tries to recover, particularly after the departure of its controversial figure, Wang Haoyu, who goes on to defect to the DPP. So I look at the way the party tries to rebuild links with social movements that it had alienated. For example, the algal reef protection movement in Taoyuan, and the anti-nuclear movement. And also I look at the way that the party tries to rebrand itself. I summarize my response to the key research questions, but I also do something that I promised to do back when I started the project in 2012, and that was to look at some of the practical lessons that had come out of this analysis of 24 years party history. So, for example, I talk about the way that the party could improve its alliance strategies, the way that the party could improve its organization, and the way that the party could potentially improve its campaign strategies. So tonight's talk is, tonight's talk is part of a world tour. This is I think the 11th talk that I've done on this book. That's included universities in Europe, the US, but it's also included media talks and talks that have gone on just been for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 hour. One of the things that I want to do in the future is to engage more with actual Green parties and Green Party members. That's something that I haven't managed to do yet, but I hope to do in the future. For example, but I also would like to take this book to Taiwan. Ideally, not doing online talks. And this is one of my Green Party talks that I did during the research process. And the other thing that I'm doing, because I'm still not ready to start the next project, is working on a Chinese language version of the book. So I'm working with 3 former party leaders, but also academics, on a Chinese version. But it's not exactly a translated version. It's more a revised and rewritten Chinese book that has both my perspective analysis, but also bringing in the observations and analysis of my co-authors. And we're currently in the early stage of this, just with a few draft chapters. And lastly, the book is available both on the Routledge site, but also on Amazon. The ebook is better priced. The hardback is only really for libraries. And I would strongly encourage you to also encourage your local librarians to get the ebook. And I'm not sure if you have the book yet in the University of Washington library. And what I'd then like to do next is to move on to some questions. And also, please feel free to email me with any questions once you've had a chance to read chapters from the book. And please do leave comments on Amazon. And yeah, I look forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Fell. That was a really fascinating presentation. I haven't read your book yet, but this really makes me want to go. I'll have to check if our library has a copy. If not, I'll put it in that purchase order and make sure to read it over the summer. So I would like to encourage our audience to go ahead and ask any questions you have for Dr. Fell. Use the comments if you're viewing on YouTube or on Facebook, and we will go ahead and see those. There's a slight lag, so we'll get to those once we have comments coming in. I actually have a number of questions for you, Dafydd, if I could go ahead and ask you first. I don't want to take up all the time, but maybe I can ask this question first. What are the Green Party's environmental policies and positions, and do you think those have an effect upon their electoral success? And I was also wondering, as a maybe just as a very specific instance, if the Fukushima incident in 2011 had any kind of effect on its subsequent success in the elections that followed.
Yeah, that's a great couple of questions. The Green Party is established back in 1996, and the anti-nuclear movement is critical to that formation. So the one area of long-term continuity is anti-nuclear activism. So, for example, even before the party is established, it's working on trying to recall pro-nuclear KMT politicians. For example, even before the party is established, it was trying to recall people like Han Guoyu. And part of the reason why it does quite well in Taipei in 1996 is that there's a fourth nuclear power station referendum held on the same day in Taipei City as the election. And that's something that's important throughout the party's history. And among the younger and older generation of the party. And I think you're right that Fukushima does have an impact. I think it helps bring that issue back onto the agenda after it had been dormant for a period of time. But I would say that the party tries to broaden its appeals as it moves into its kind of post-dormant era. So environmental issues are always important, always central to the party's appeals, but it's part of a range of issue appeals. But I think they do look at a range of other environmental issues, such as climate change, air pollution, And I think one of the other factors is that the party has tended to be led by environmentalists for much of the party's history. So if we think about the phase one, in the 1990s, the Pan Han Shen era, when Pan is very, very focused on local level environmentalism, things like tree protection, for example. And the party also branches out into other areas, for example, animal welfare, animal protection is another kind of appeal. And then in the Li Gengzhen era, Li is the head of a southern Taiwan-based environmental NGO. So again, we see a lot of attention to areas such as air pollution, water pollution in the party's appeals. But this has been less visible in the period leading up to 2020. But I would say that this is something that the party is trying to kind of reconnect to, and that's why they're quite strong on this algal reef protection movement that's so salient at the moment. This build up to this this referendum. But the party, of course, has that challenge. How do you kind of reconnect with those environmental groups that have got alienated in the Wang Haoyu era? And how do you kind of steal back your own original issues when the DUP has tried to claim these issues, but also you have the competition of the New Power Party, who's one of their key figures is an award-winning environmentalist. So that environmental appeal is actually more competitive now, because even the KMT is talking about environmentalism, even though it's a different style of environmentalism. But maybe that's a success, making in the environment so salient, putting nuclear issues on the agenda, affecting mainstream parties. And if we think comparatively, the anti-nuclear movement in Taiwan is much more successful than the anti-nuclear movement in the UK, where I live, where there's very, very limited opposition to nuclear power. So I'm quite impressed with the overall achievements of this movement.
Dafydd, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about something that you mentioned in the talk, and as well as just in your answer right now, which is about the overlap in policies and in voters between the Green Party and kind of adjacent pan Green / pan left parties like the New Power Party, the State Building Party, and the DPP. What are the reasons for this kind of shifting of voters between these groups? Are there specific policies of the Green Party that are unique to the Green Party that the other parties don't share, or do you see that as mostly overlapping?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that we see when we look at the changing voter structure is that the market for alternative parties has increased over time, but it's become more competitive. Now, one of the challenges for these smaller parties, and I think this also applied to the splinter parties, is how do you actually get reliable voters who will vote for you time and again, which the two mainstream parties do have those kind of core voters. In contrast, the smaller parties have tended to be much more reliant on floating voters that may switch back and forth between elections. So that was part of the reason why those splinter parties rose and fell. And to a certain extent, I would say that the movement parties have that challenge. So it's not just issues, but it's also party organization, party branches that are, I think, also important. Having candidates that can hang on to voters, that have that kind of candidate appeal. Now, I think that over time, the Green Party has been successful at bringing new and exciting issues on the agenda. Things like same-sex marriage, I think, is a great example. But what happens when the mainstream parties try to steal those issues? And I think 2016 was one such case when Taiwan does come out openly on same-sex marriage. And if we look at the 2020 campaign, the Green Party does try to bring in new issues. For example, legalizing medicinal use of marijuana, for example, which gives the party a slightly alternative image. But maybe that's just too niche. And again, we come back to this issue of relations with China and national identity. Even though the Green Party has tended to have a very clear pro-independence position, it's never seen as strong on China as its rivals. So I think that's always one of the problems with when the electoral agenda is too focused on the China issue. The party often will struggle to make a breakthrough. So ideally, the campaign agenda should be focused on more social issues. But because a lot of these elections are held on the same day as a presidential election, that is often quite challenging.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point about the China question. I think that's an important factor to consider. I didn't think about that. We actually have a really interesting question from an audience member, something that I am very interested to hear your answer about as well. In light of the present water shortage and the position on nuclear, how does the Green Party approach desalination plants and green energy creation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I have to admit, I don't know the answer on the water shortage issue, but I do know that the current situation for the anti-nuclear movement, which includes the Green Party, is very, very challenging. And a part of the reason for this is the counter movement, the pro-nuclear movement, something that Hermin Show has written about in Taiwan Inside, which is a really interesting case study. And they were successful in those 2018 referendums, which suggested a switch in position away from in 2014, 2016, it looked like the anti-nuclear movement had basically won. But 2018 suggested a quite changed picture. And I think that's why the referendums that we have this summer are really worth paying attention to. To what extent has the anti-nuclear movement learned lessons of setback in 2018? That's a big question to look at, because it would be a real nightmare for the anti-nuclear movement to see, after 3 decades of struggle, for that 4th nuclear power station to be started up. But it's a very, very difficult political environment to operate in, particularly when we've had power cuts and discussion and very successful communication and mobilization of this by this counter movement. Generally, in Taiwanese sociology, we tend to focus much more on progressive movements, but looking at these conservative movements, I think, is an important challenge.
So we have another question about, can the Green Party keep Taiwan free? It seems like you did address this a little bit, but I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more on this question.
Yeah, keep Taiwan free. Yeah, what exactly does that mean? If that is related to the threat from China, then okay, the Green Party has tended to take quite a clear-cut pro de facto independence stance. It's not going to. It's very anti-CCP, but it won't have that kind of almost ethnic nationalism kind of appeal that we often see from, let's say, certain parts of the DVP, and also, let's say, the state building party. It has a much more international appeal, but that can be a challenge, and we saw that in 2020 when those kind of people that were most scared of the China threat tended to go for the DVP or the state building party.
Going back to the earlier question about the water shortage, I wonder if I can maybe reframe that question and talk about something broader. You mentioned climate change, and I do think that the water shortage is kind of tied up with that. Do we see the Green Party looking at, or the Green Party is looking at climate change in more of an international or transnational light? Here in the United States, the movement behind a so-called New Green Deal and seeing climate change as a global battle where cooperation needs to be held with China. And this is one of the areas that the new Biden administration has tried to push as an area of cooperation. Do we see that in Taiwan, or is it still mostly concerned about local environmental issues?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, the Green Party is definitely the most international party in Taiwan, and it does engage with what other Green parties are talking about, particularly in areas such as climate change, but it struggles to engage with China. Probably only one or two of the Green Party figures are frequent China visitors, or at least they were until quite recently. There's still a suspicion of those that are more engaged with China, and this is also linked to the base of the party. In other words, the base of the party is actually not necessarily coming out of ex-KMT families. So a lot of both the Green Party activists, but also supporters, are those that hate both parties. And that is one of the reasons why there are people that are maybe not pro-unification, but supportive of working more with China. In fact, one of the most well-known Green Party figures even was a close ally of Ma Ying-jeou when he was Taipei city mayor, and actually worked in as an official in Ma Ying-jeou's Taipei city government. And when we look at where the party has been more successful, it's often been in parts of Taiwan where the KMT is stronger. For example, Taoyuan, Hsinchu, Taipei city. Well, often it's much harder for the party to actually catch strong DVP supporters. So I kind of answered that question in a kind of a roundabout way. But I would say that it's those international links with international Green parties that is kind of more significant, and that link with China isn't really strong. And I think part of the reason, of course, is that the squeezing of space of civil society in China has also been a factor there. That it's particularly if we think about what's happened to Chinese or Taiwanese activists that have gone to China. That is, I think, another factor. But I do see even in 2020, I did see a couple of Green Party figures still going to the PRC and working on number of projects, but they're really the exception.
All right, we have another audience question. You mentioned that the public focuses on the mainstream through smaller parties bringing up interesting views. So I wonder how can these smaller parties plan to make their next moves to gain more, I assume, recognition or greater electoral gains?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I guess one of the things about this project is that I found it much more difficult to be neutral. When I was working on mainstream parties, I think I was quite successful at keeping distance from the parties. So I would go in and do my interviews, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and that would be it. There wouldn't really be a relationship. But with the Green Party figures, I became much more involved. And I think that led me to care more about the development of the party and to actually hope that in some way doing this kind of research might be able to actually have to help the party to recover and to grow. I'm not sure if that is too naive or not, but I think it's one of the. I think it's very difficult to work. I think if you're working with social movements, I think maybe it's similar that you get very kind of caught up in that kind of idealism, and I think that's one of the reasons why I decided to have a section in the book that looked at what the party could do, and when I ended the book, I was kind of cautiously optimistic, looking at the way that the party was rebuilding in the first 6 months after the 2020 setback. The big challenge to look at is going to be how the party performs in the 2022, which is next year, local elections. So I'd be interested to see how the party starts to prepare, and it's going to need to start really getting into preparation by the autumn of this year. So that's something that I am going to look at. My personal view is that it's very important for Taiwan's democracy and Taiwan's party system to have alternatives and not just have to the two kind of big choices. And even the splinter parties have tended to be kind of all versions of their mother parties. So not really adding much in terms of diversity. So I think there are opportunities when we come to the 2022 local elections. It's just a matter of who will be the main alternative party. Will it be the New Power Party? Will it be the State Building Party? Both seem to have their weaknesses. So that creates an opportunity. But a lot really depends on the kind of strategies. To what extent can the Green Party, bring back those that have drifted away from the party, both supporters and figures? So one of the things that also comes through in the book is the way that the party builds up experience and then loses it as people argue, drift away, and then that valuable experience is lost, and then they have to rebuild again. So one of the things I encourage the party to do is to try to not only reach out to new figures, but also to try and bring back that experience. Something like 90% of the Green Party candidates only stand once and then never stand again. That's very different from the kind of patterns that we see in most other parties. And we could see examples where, for example, candidates that have left the party have gone on to be successful when they keep trying. So lost human resources, I think, are so important in party politics.
What do you think is responsible for that discontinuity, the inability to retain human resources? I mean, when we recall like famous figures leaving some of these other movement parties that it's big news, especially if they're popular figures. But I guess maybe the Green parties don't have that kind of profile.
I think a lot of it is to do with party culture and the ability to deal with conflict. Often, what we see is arguments and then splits, or people defecting away. That often with maybe better human resource management, this could have been handled better. Of course, funding is always a big challenge, because we can only survive as activists for so long. But we need, as we get to middle age, we need a steady income. So we can see why potentially some figures may kind of defect away. So one of the big things that I do look at is how successful the party was in fundraising, and this is often a major element in success and failure. But again, I think it's really important having that diverse appeal, and not just selling your soul, as we see in the 2018 and 2020 era.
Could you also maybe comment about the differences in fundraising between the Green parties and perhaps the other movement parties or some of the other splinter parties?
So fundraising is a really interesting question, and also a question that it's very, very difficult to get good data on. Often it's a little bit secretive. I think the party has struggled to get donations from, let's say, alternative or ethical businesses. I think that's and it's tended to have quite a small membership base, so that's always been an issue for party funding. So if we think about the fact that the party is often only having a few hundred members, but it can get something like 200,000 or 300,000 votes. That's quite impressive. But of course, funding is often controversial. And let's say, for example, this is one area where I struggled to get data. That was on the funding in the 2020 election, when the party was actually probably at its best funded level. But the fact that they were getting funding from questionable sources, and I still don't know exactly how the funding was working for that campaign, that also has its risks. In contrast, I think the DVP and the New Power Party have been much more successful at gaining funds. It would appear that having a very clear-cut Taiwan independence stance is a good way to get funds. But I think the party just has to be more imaginative in the way that it raises money. And I think the fact that it had a quite well-funded campaign in 2016 does show the potential. But what you need here is very different skills. Fundraising is one type of skill. Human resource management is another one. Having very strong campaigns. So you need kind of different types of leadership. So that's why I often come back to this issue of human resources being critical.
All right. I continue to encourage the audience. Please go ahead and ask any questions you might have for Dr. Fell. Without these questions, I will just continue to ask Dr. Fell my personal interest questions, of which I have many. It's just such a touches on so many aspects of Taiwan. I wonder if there might be an overlap between kind of, or maybe even a conflict between the some of the major environmental issues of today that might open up splits with other parties that might have other ideological alignments. So perhaps to give you a couple examples, one is about if you could think about the new reef issue, which has created unusual splits. The same thing, I guess, for nuclear power, talking 2021 kind of with regards to the number 4 power plants. And also I was wondering about maybe indigenous issues. Has the Green parties, have they taken an issue on nuclear waste, for example, and how to process nuclear waste? Does that put them in alignment with parties that might appeal to indigenous voters?
Yeah, they're two really fascinating questions. I really like those questions, because I think, I mean, one of the issues that has been a constant, even though the party is established, it's a social movement based political party. When it's formed, we often see tension between environmental and social movement NGOs and the party. And this was first apparent to me when I first started doing the field work. I wasn't expecting that potential tension between the two. And at certain periods in the party's history, it handles that relationship better. For example, in the 2016 campaign, it really tries hard to be the representative and the spokesperson of social movements. But in the 2018 to 2020 period, the party seems to break that link. So, for example, it falls out with the algal reef protection movement in Taoyuan, for example. And it falls out with those labor movement activists that had supported the party in 2016. And a lot of it was down to this controversial elected figure in Taoyuan, who put more stress on winning elections above everything else, even if it means working as in a semi-alliance with the DBP. So again, that is one of the areas that I touch upon for what the party should be doing. In other words, it needs to have a good relationship with these NGOs, and not have the worry that they feel that the Green Party is exploiting them. And that sometimes did come up in some of the research. The second part of your question, I think, is a really fantastic question. I think it's something that the Green Party should focus on, because other mainstream parties, I think, have struggled to really fully engage with the indigenous Taiwan issue. We've seen the way that one of the most visible protests has been about indigenous land justice in the Taiwan era. So I think there's real potential there. It's not going to be a great vote getter, but I think it's something that the Green Party should do based on its kind of core values. I would say the party's had mixed success here, but it has had it has at times reached out to Taiwan's indigenous community. For example, among the party's 3 party list candidates in 1996, one was an indigenous musician and activist. And in one of the party's most interesting campaigns, it nominated an anti-nuclear activist in Lanyu in 2012, and made that one of the key features of the 2012 campaign. And there we saw that allowed the party to engage both with gender, because it was the candidate was a single mother, but also an anti-nuclear activist. So we see a lot of discussion on the nuclear waste issue. And interestingly, that really paid off, because in that in the party list vote in 2012, the Green Party comes second in Lanyu. So the KMT wins with something like 30 something, and the Green Party gets only a few points short of the KMT. In terms of the party's organizational structure, it has a really interesting co-convener system. So one male and one female co-convener, which is, I think, unique for Taiwan. But also it has a indigenous reserve seat in the Central Executive Committee. So that there is that attempt there, but it takes. I think it's something that the party should engage with. I can see, for example, in Canada, the Canadian Greens have engaged a lot on Indigenous issues, and I think personally, I think that's something that the party should focus more on.
Thank you, Dafydd. So we have a number of questions that have come in just in the last couple of minutes. I think since we only have about 3 minutes left, maybe what I'll do is I'll read all the questions for you, and you can pick and choose or see if you can answer all of them. One is kind of following up on our last conversation, asking about the representation of the Indigenous population, even though they're a small number for the Green parties. The next is how does the Green Party, or can the Green parties, take a role in managing Taiwan's transition from coal to gas and its power plants? Good questions that I'm curious about as well. And whether it relies or can rely on the US and Australia and others for gas import and infrastructure. And the final question is, would they support efforts to allow Indigenous peoples to import and own modern hunting weapons? I guess this is very relevant to the very recent kind of ruling about hunting. Would that be a major policy gift to gain favor? All very interesting questions. I'll leave them to you.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that the post-2020 Green Party has tried to stand with this Indigenous activist land justice protests. So again, so that approach is quite distinct from that of the 2018 to 2020 period. So it's now willing to take a stance in opposition to the ruling party. The last question I think is a really interesting one, because a number of studies that look at environmental politics in Taiwan have found that often there is a tension between environmental groups and Indigenous activist groups. And one of those key areas has been, well, one of them has been on things like national parks, where there were clashes, for example, in the Chen Shui-bian era, between Indigenous communities and environmentalists. But the hunting is another area where there often is slightly different perspectives. I've not actually seen a huge amount on the hunting issue. My expectation, I need to double check this, is that they would be supportive of the call for deregulation on Indigenous hunting. But I would like to double check before I'd say I'm certain on this. And the question before that on the coal to gas, I think is a really important one. And I think it's one that the party has struggled with, because the previous leadership were supportive of the gas plants, despite the fact that it would damage the algal reefs. So they were taking that line, while the current leadership is taking a much more kind of clear-cut environmental stance, even though it doesn't resolve the problem of the reliance on coal. So I agree that it is a really tricky issue, where, but I think it's on the positive side. At least it means that Taiwan is talking about these issues, and not just, if we compare to, let's say, when I first started living in Taiwan in that first decade or so, this development above all costs philosophy was still very prevalent, both in society and in political circles. But I would say that over time that has changed. And I think that is a mark of success for Taiwan's environmental movement. So it's not only substantive effects, but I think the way that the environmental movement has been able to change public opinion and change values, I think, is a real great positive story. And I think that one of the great things, and I'm pretty sure James would share this, when we study Taiwan, there's just so many wonderful stories to tell. And our challenge is, how do we tell those stories? And just one final anecdote to add. One of the favorite moments in my work on the Green Party was showing a documentary about the anti-nuclear movement to a group of UK anti-nuclear activists. And I've never seen an audience so kind of moved and engaged by a Taiwanese documentary, despite the fact that they came into the room knowing nothing about Taiwan. And I think this is, I think we have a lot of these kind of stories.
Yeah, I think that does make all this research really worthwhile, to see the kinds of reactions about that. I get that in my classes sometimes, but I know for Taiwan, there's so much there for kind of transnational, international solidarity. Well, we're now at time. I wanted to thank you, Dafydd, for spending this time with us to introduce us to your new book. I want to encourage all the audience members out there to get a copy. If you're at the University of Washington, I'll make sure that the library gets a copy, an ebook copy soon, so that you'd be able to read this over the summer. But thank you so much. Give a round of applause for Dr. Fell, and thank you so much for joining us.
Fantastic. Thanks, James, for the invitation. And I look forward to hopefully coming back to Washington for the World Congress.
Yes, we very much look forward to welcoming everybody to the World Congress next year. All right.
Good luck with all the preparations.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
See you, everyone.